Welcome to this lecture on the peripheral nervous system. This continues our tour of the nervous system. And let me begin by reminding you, as you can see on this slide, that the nervous system is divided into two major components or two major divisions. The first division, the central nervous system, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And as you can see on this slide, this central nervous system is responsible for integrating, processing, and coordinating all the sensory and information that comes to it and that leaves it. In today's lecture, we want to focus not so much on the brain and the spinal cord or the sensory nervous system, but we want to focus on the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system refers to all the nervous structures that lie outside of the brain and the spinal cord. And these structures basically allow the CNS to receive sensory information. This sensory information is then processed within the central nervous system, and then commands are outputted to glands and muscles via the motor system. So let's just take some time to look at this slide and to follow the process that's being described on this slide. Let me begin, and if you can just follow my mouse, by pointing out some of the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. These nerves either come off the brain stem, in which case they're known as the cranial nerves, or they can come off the spinal cord, in which case they are known as spinal nerves. And sometimes a lot of these nerves come together to form what looks like a very complicated mesh of nerves, and we would call this a plexus. So in this region of the body, by the shoulder area, you have what is known as the brachial plexus. Now down here we have an arrow that says start, and this can almost be viewed as the beginning of the process, hence the arrow start. And the process starts when your body detects a particular sensation. For example, it might detect the sensation of touch, or it might detect the sensation of vision. Let's use the example of touch because we're going to focus more on the spinal nerves in this lecture. You have touch receptors all over your body, and receptors are the sensory structures that are able to detect the changes in the environment. So you have specialized receptors in your body, specialized structures in your body that lie on the surface of your skin or lie deep in your skin that allow your body to detect touch. Now touch has many submodalities. You can have crude touch like itch or tickle, or you can have what we call discriminatory touch, the ability to distinguish 2 points in space. But let's just focus on the general principle that we have receptors that can detect touch. Now, these receptors can come from two different regions. One can come from your internal organs, and we call these the visceral organs. And so we can talk about the visceral sensory receptors. The other comes from the skin and the muscles and those organs of the body. And we can call these the somatic regions. And so our sensory system can consist of a somatic division and a visceral division. Once the receptors receive the information, it's then passed on to nerves in the peripheral nervous system. And these nerves take them to the central nervous system, as can be seen from this diagram, where that information is processed with all the other information that's coming towards it. So for example, you may feel something touching your big toe, but that information will be integrated with your visual information. If the thing touching your big toe is innocuous, a feather, you will probably ignore it. If the thing that's touching your big toe is something a little more dangerous or worrying, like an ant or a scorpion, you will take evasive action. That information then, you have the touch information coming from your big toe, but you also have visual information. And all of these things are processed within the central nervous system. And then a particular command goes out from the motor division through the motor nerves down to the muscles. In the motor system, we also have the division into the somatic nervous system, which controls the skeletal muscles, and which are under voluntary control, and the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the smooth and the cardiac muscles and the glands. And we'll look at these divisions in a little bit more detail. So that gives you a brief overview of the peripheral nervous system. So we can say that sensory signals are picked up by sensor receptors and carried by nerve fibers of the peripheral nervous system to the CNS. And those sensory signals are sometimes known as afferent signals. Afferent means it's taking information towards the central nervous system. We can then say that motor signals are carried away from the central nervous system to innervate muscles and glands. And we call these signals efferent signals. So efferent or efferent signals take information away from the central nervous system, and afferent signals bring information towards the central nervous system. And we just said that you can divide the peripheral nervous system into the somatic regions and the visceral regions. Somatic refers to the skin and the muscles, the skeletal muscles, whereas the visceral regions refer to the internal organs, which primarily consist of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and all the organs of your body like the liver that carry out very many important functions. And this results in four main subdivisions of our peripheral nervous system: somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, and visceral motor. And you can just see these demonstrated in this diagram here. Again, you see the interaction or the coordination between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is your afferent division. It's divided into somatic and visceral, whereas the motor nervous system is your efferent division. It's also divided into somatic and visceral. And you can spend some time just looking at this slide and looking at some of the examples of each component of the peripheral nervous system. So let me just focus a little bit on the nerves that are originating and connecting through the spinal cord. I mentioned to you before that spinal nerves leave from the spinal cord. Cranial nerves leave from the brainstem. The cranial nerves go to innervate the face, the muscles of the face, the sensory receptors on the tongue, the sensory receptors responsible for processing sight. So these cranial nerves are very important in processing information that has to do with the head and neck. The spinal nerves leave the spinal cord, and they're important for processing information that has to do with the rest of the body. And we're focusing primarily on the spinal nerves. And so in this diagram here, you can see the arrangement of these nerves and how they interact with the spinal cord. The sensory nerve is in blue, and you can see the sensory nerve is connected to receptors that are found in the skin. These receptors synapse, or they talk to the sensory nerve, and then the sensory nerve enters the spinal cord through what is called the dorsal root, or the posterior part of the spinal cord. The correct term is dorsal. The information goes into the spinal cord, which, as we know, is part of the central nervous system. It can be processed in the spinal cord itself, or it can be fed upwards towards the brain. And then commands are sent back out through that spinal nerve via the motor division, which now goes to the muscles or the glands. And this is a very regular arrangement that repeats itself at every single spinal segment, which is associated with a particular vertebra in your vertebral column. And so you can see here your vertebral column, and lying inside of your vertebral column is your spinal cord. And the spinal cord is divided into spinal segments, and each is associated with a spinal nerve. And we have 8 plus 12 is 20, plus 5 plus 5 plus 1 is 31. So we have 31 spinal nerves, which are named according to the region from which they arrive. 8 cervical, cervical refers to the neck. 12 thoracic, referring to the thoracic. 5 lumbar, referring to the lower back region. 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, referring to the tail region of an animal, which would be we don't have a tail in humans, but it would be present in other animals. One of the interesting things to note is that the vertebral column is actually longer than the spinal cord. As a result, the nerves that leave the lower segments of the spinal cord all have to move downwards before they exit the vertebral column. And this creates a mesh of nerves, which is called the chorda equina, or horse's tail, because of how it looks anatomically. So just to remind you again, you have your vertebral column, which consists of your vertebra. And inside of the vertebral column, you have your spinal cord, which is divided into spinal segments. And from each segment arises a pair of spinal nerves, which leave the vertebral column through small holes or holes in the vertebra called the intervertebral foramina. And this is just a diagram of the brachial plexus. Remember, I told you that as the nerves leave the spinal cord, they can form very complex arrangements. And you can see some of this here in this diagram taken from a cadaver. And in this diagram, you have the brachial plexus, and you can see each one of these nerves has an actual name. As students of this course, you aren't required to know these names, but I just want you to appreciate that anatomists or anatomists have taken the time to dissect these nerves and trace these nerves and follow these nerves. Painstaking work, and they've taken the time to name these nerves, and that allows us in clinical situations to know what might be going wrong in the human body. Here's another example showing the complexity of the nerves leaving the spinal cord in the lower region of the back as they go down to innervate the gluteal region and the muscles of the leg. You can see a picture here on the left of nerves as they leave the spinal cord, and you can see how they traverse throughout the body. And I just want to point out here that some of these nerves can be very, very long. You can see your sciatic nerve leaving from the vertebral column and running down the back of your leg, and it can be up to 1 meter in length. And this contrasts with the nerves that you might find in the brain, which some of them can be very tiny, less than 1 millimeter in length. And so the nervous system has tremendous diversity. Now, this arrangement of spinal cords gives rise to a concept called the dermatomes. The dermatomes are areas of skin innervated by cutaneous branches of a single spinal nerve. What that simply means is that each spinal nerve goes to a certain part of your skin, and that allows you to map your body according to the nerve that innervates it, or the nerve that services it. Now, this is very important from a clinical point of view, because if a patient comes to you or a client comes to you and they're having a problem in one part of their body, by looking at the area of the body that is affected, you can determine which particular nerve might be affected. And so you can see that the C4 nerve innervates this region just below the neck. The C5 nerve innervates this region in the upper chest. T1 through T12 innervate the thorax and the torso, both on the front or the anterior of a human and also on his back. Okay. And so this information is very, very important clinically, and it allows our doctors and our other health professionals to determine where there might be a problem with the peripheral nervous system. We want to switch focus a little bit now and focus on the autonomic nervous system. Those spinal nerves that I was speaking to you about, they go to innervate the skin and the skeletal muscles. But there's another component of the peripheral nervous system that's important for innervating not skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles are muscles that you control voluntarily. These would be examples of this would be like muscles of your arm, your biceps and your triceps, or muscles of your leg, your quadriceps, or your calf muscles. There are other types of muscles in your body, and we call these the cardiac muscle found in the heart, and the smooth muscle that's found in many of your internal organs, like your lungs. The airway passages in your lungs have smooth muscle that allow those passages to get wider to allow more air in, or narrower if you don't want as much air in. Or the blood vessels, they have smooth muscle in their walls, which also allow them to dilate to bring more blood to an organ, or to constrict to bring less blood to an organ. So for example, after a meal, your body will end up being a process of digestion, and the blood vessels going towards your intestinal system or your gut will dilate to process the products of that meal. But if you're running a race, at that point your gut is not important, and so the blood vessels to the gut will constrict, whereas the blood vessels to the muscles that are important for running that race will dilate to ensure your muscles receive adequate blood supply and adequate oxygen. Now, the autonomic nervous system is a component of the peripheral nervous system that acts below the level of your consciousness. That's why it's called autonomic. And so those examples I was just describing to you, the process of dilation of your blood vessels after you've eaten a meal, or constriction of those going to the gut and dilation of those going to the muscles when you're about to run a race. All of those processes are taking place inside of your body and you are not aware of them. It is acting below the level of your consciousness. And the function of the autonomic nervous system is to maintain body homeostasis. Homeostasis is a term which simply means your body has to have a fairly constant internal environment in order to function. Let me give you a very simple example of homeostasis. In the Caribbean environment, you do not have wide fluctuations of temperature, but in any 24-hour day, the temperature can shift from maybe 24 degrees Celsius in the night to up to 35 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius during the day. That's a vast change in your external environment. In order for your body to function though, your body functions best at a particular temperature of 37 degrees. And homeostasis is the process by which your body maintains an internal temperature of 37 degrees in the face of these vast external changes. And the system of the body that takes care of this, one of the major systems that takes care of this, is your autonomic nervous system. And it doesn't just take care of temperature, it regulates the levels of hormones in your body, it regulates the levels of blood glucose and other nutrients in your blood. It is doing so many things. It regulates your blood pressure, it regulates your heart rate, and so your autonomic nervous system is constantly working. Now, this autonomic nervous system is divided into two. It's divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's what's trying to be captured by this image on your screen. The autonomic nervous system has a sympathetic division shown here in a greenish color and a parasympathetic division here shown here in a reddish brown color. Almost every single organ in your body has what we call a dual innervation. It receives nerves both from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. This diagram here is trying to capture the same thing, and it shows you very, very well the dual innervation. On the left in a teal color, you have the sympathetic nervous system. And on the right in a green color, you have the parasympathetic nervous system. And if we just take one example, the heart muscle shown here in the middle of the diagram, you can see it's receiving sympathetic input, but it's also receiving parasympathetic input. If you go a little higher, you can look at the lungs. The lungs is receiving sympathetic input, but it's also receiving parasympathetic input. And you can see the vastness and the array of the autonomic nervous system, and the fact that it's literally innervating every single organ of your body and continually working to maintain these systems all below the level of your consciousness. Now, that means that homeostasis, or the work that the autonomic nervous system is doing, is actually a dynamic balance between the two branches, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Now, this means we can divide the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic into opposite ends of the spectrum. The sympathetic might be most familiar to you because the sympathetic causes a response called fight or flight. And the sympathetic nervous system gets activated when your body is getting ready to do something, or your body has to respond to a threat. Hence the example here of a snake and somebody sees a snake and decides that they want to run away, which I think would be the response of most of us. The sympathetic nervous system therefore either prepares you to fight, engage in an activity, or flee, flight, run away from a situation, avoid a situation. And the sympathetic nervous system therefore is catabolic. It expends energy. It causes your body to burn calories and burn energy. And so you can think of what are the things that will require you to fight or to flight. What are the things that require you to engage or to flee? And you can see immediately that some of them are very, very obvious and appear right there on your screen. There would be an increase in heart rate. You will have the airway passages that are going to your lungs dilating to allow more oxygen to get to your lungs and then into the body. Your blood glucose levels will increase so that there's more energy coming to the body. Your eyes will dilate so that more light can get into your eyes so that information can be processed by the brain. And so once you know that the overall effect of the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, it gives you a general idea of what's going to take place when the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, as we said, it does the opposite. The parasympathetic nervous system, therefore, can be termed feed and breed, or some people use the term rest and digest. The parasympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's active when you're resting, when not much is going on, as demonstrated by this gentleman who's lying down. Okay. When that is taking place, well, again, what will be happening in your body? There will be a decrease in blood rate. There will be an increase in digestive activity, because often you're resting after you've eaten a meal. The blood vessels to your organs will dilate, whereas the blood vessels to your muscles will constrict. Your pupils will constrict because less light is required. And so you can see that when you're at rest, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over to achieve certain things and to build up energy and to build up a lot of anabolic processes in your body. Whereas when you're preparing to fight or engage in processes, your sympathetic nervous system takes over. And just to remind you then that all your organs have this dual innervation, a brake and an accelerator, which allows your body to have a lot of control over each organ. Now I just want to focus a little bit on the fight or flight response, because the fight or flight response is part of a wider response of the body known as the stress response. Remember we said the fight or flight response kicks in when your body is getting prepared for action, when something's going on in your environment and your body has to react to it. The stress response is a physiological reaction caused by the perception of challenging, aversive, or threatening situations. So you have an exam to write. In order to prepare your body to write the exam, there is a little bit of a stress response. In that case, it's not a bad thing because it's actually preparing your body to engage in the exam. If you see an animal like a snake, that's a threatening situation and you might want to run away. And then you have the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, activating. But the stress response is much bigger than just the autonomic nervous system. It includes a number of stress hormones that get released into the blood, and they do a lot of the same things that the autonomic nervous system does. They increase blood pressure, they increase respiratory rate, they increase blood flow to the skeletal muscles, they increase your blood sugar levels. And so the autonomic nervous system is an integral part of the stress response. Now, the stress response is controlled by something called the HPA axis. The H in the HPA axis stands for the hypothalamus, which is a very small region in your brain. The P in the HPA axis stands for the pituitary gland, which is another small region in your brain that releases a lot of hormones. And the A in HPA stands for the adrenal cortex, which is part of your adrenal glands that's located in your peritoneal or abdominal cavity. Together, these three organs or these three structures have a unique connection based on the hormones that they released. The hypothalamus is a key structure in your brain, and it receives information from your cortex. So the minute your brain perceives something challenging or threatening, it causes the hypothalamus to activate. And the hypothalamus releases a hormone called the corticotrophin releasing hormone. The corticotrophin releasing hormone then goes to the anterior pituitary gland, and it causes the pituitary gland to release a hormone called ACTH, the adrenocorticotrophic hormone. And the adrenocorticotrophic hormone goes into the blood and acts on the adrenal cortex and causes it to release a whole set of stress hormones, one of which is known as cortisol, which you might have heard before. And so this HPA axis is a key axis or a key system inside of the body that regulates the stress response. One of the things that you will notice here is that cortisol itself inhibits the hypothalamus, and therefore the hypothalamus starts the process of releasing cortisol, but as the levels of cortisol increase in the blood, it tells the hypothalamus stop secreting CRH. Therefore, it causes the levels of cortisol not to get too high. Now, the HPA axis is important because it's the start of the stress response. And you can just look on this diagram and you can see that the hypothalamus starts the stress response, causing the adrenal medulla to activate. The hypothalamus is also what tells the sympathetic nervous system to activate. The end result of both processes is a massive release of norepinephrine or noradrenaline into the body. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same hormone. One is an American term, epinephrine. The other is the British term, adrenaline. And norepinephrine and epinephrine are two compounds that are very similar, just slight chemical modifications. So you can talk about norepinephrine and epinephrine, or noradrenaline and noradrenaline. And so the stress response is a massive results in a massive release of adrenaline into the body, both through the HPA axis and through activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And this allows your body to respond very vigorously when confronted with a particular situation. Now, why did I take the time to go through the stress response? Well, it's an important part of daily living. And one of the scientists who studied this, Sele, came up with something called the general adaptation syndrome. And he was trying to look at the process by which stress is both good, but then it can also become harmful. And he created this diagram in which he defined the stress response, or he divided the stress response into 3 stages. Stage 1 is the alarm stage. Stage 2 is the resistance stage. And stage 3 is the exhaustion stage. In the alarm stage, you recognize that the stress is there. Body homeostasis goes a little bit out of whack. It changes a little bit as you respond to that stressor. And as you move into the resistance stage, your body adapts to combat the stressor. So this is the whole process that we're telling you about. The end result of these 2 processes are you're supposed to be able to effectively engage the stressor and then move back to a place of equilibrium where the stressor is no longer there. Unfortunately, in life today, there are many situations where stressors are continually around us, and this resistance stage can get prolonged. And if you don't have the ability to continually adapt to this prolonged stressor, you can step over to stage 3, where you enter into an exhaustion stage, where energy resources begin to get depleted and different things begin to get depleted. And you enter into a maladaptive state. And that can result in a number of stress-related disorders that can even have physiological manifestations. Too much levels of stress actually affects the body function. So for example, the stress hormones actually reduce the immune system. So people who are under prolonged stress are more likely to get a cold. The stress hormones can lead to changes in your gut processes. So people under prolonged stress can get ulcers. And at this stage, you can also begin to get a host of psychological conditions if you're not able to adapt to the stress and you enter into the exhaustion stage. At this stage, something has to happen to allow restoration of homeostasis or return back to equilibrium, or that stressor can have a long and prolonged effect on the body that could over time lead to death. So I just want you to be aware that stress is generally considered good for us. It prepares us for action in small doses. But if it continues too long and your body can no longer combat it, you can enter into a stage where it begins to affect you negatively, and it can have both physiological bodily effects and also psychological effects. Let us close by just talking a little bit about the polygraph. Now, the autonomic nervous system, as I've told you, changes so many things in your body. It changes your breathing rate. It changes how much you sweat. It changes your heart rate. And this allows us to actually measure these changes. We can measure these changes. And this is most often done by a polygraph, which you may have seen in movies and cartoons, like this image taken from The Simpsons. You can wire somebody with a series of electrodes designed to measure their breathing, their sweating, their heart rate, and you can track the autonomic nervous system. You can track how the autonomic nervous system is working. And researchers do this all the time to measure people's response to stress, to measure different aspects of the autonomic nervous system. But the polygraph has been particularly used to serve a function called a lie detector. Now, scientific opinion is split about whether the polygraph works, and many people can say that they can cheat the polygraph. But the basic principle that a polygraph seems to be working on is that when you lie, it evokes a stress response. When you tell an untruth, somehow there's a change in your autonomic nervous system activity, and this can be detected by the polygraph. Whether this is true or not, or whether it works 100% of the time, has not been conclusively proven. But I just want you to understand the basic principle here of the polygraph, which is you can measure the activity of the autonomic nervous system. And this can give us very useful information. I don't need you to focus on this so much as is being used in this situation in the Simpsons cartoon. And with that in mind, I thought I'd just end by showing you a little video from National Geographic that just talks about the polygraph. So before I show you this video, let me just remind you that in this session today, we've looked at the peripheral nervous system. We've said that the peripheral nervous system is divided into sensory divisions and motor divisions. But we also saw that in the sensory and the motor divisions, that you have sensory nerves that innervate the somatic part of our body, and you have sensory nerves that provide innervation to the visceral internal organs. And that division is also true for your motor system. We also saw that the sensory nervous system and the motor nervous system of the peripheral nervous system leave the brain and spinal cord through cranial nerves and spinal nerves, respectively. And we looked a little bit at the structure of those spinal nerves and how they work inside of the body. Then we spent the latter part of this lecture focusing on the autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that controls all the daily activities that are taking place in your body, and you're not even aware of it. The part of the nervous system that controls your heart rate and your breathing rate. We saw that this nervous system, this division, is divided into a sympathetic branch and a parasympathetic branch. And these two branches act in opposition to one another. Sympathetic is known as fight or flight. Parasympathetic is known as rest and digest. And then we went a little bit into the stress response and looked at the polygraph. So with that in mind, let's conclude by just looking at this video.
Hello, Johnny.
Hi there.
Would you like to take a seat?
Sure.
The lie detector, or polygraph. We've all seen the movies. Some steely-eyed spy trying to conceal the truth from a mysterious interrogator. But can you beat a lie detector in real life?
Lying is a stressful business. The natural physiological reactions to telling a big fat whopper is that your pulse quickens, you breathe faster, and you start to sweat. Polygraphs work by detecting these changes, so any spike on the chart can indicate stress and therefore the possibility of a lie. So, the key to deceiving a lie detector is to try and hide your real stress levels.
24 hours earlier, I nicked Richard's games console. The question was, could I hide my act of dishonesty from the machine? I was hooked up to it so that my breathing, skin conductivity and blood pressure could be measured. Polygraph tests start with the examiner asking a series of basic questions to which the answers are known to be true. This establishes a baseline which indicates the average stress levels of that individual.
Now, one rumoured technique used by old spies was to put a drawing pin in their shoe. Now I'm going to press my toes down onto this pin during the baseline questions. Hopefully the pain will increase my stress levels so that during the potentially incriminating questions, my nervous stress won't register any higher on the charts.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I just need you to answer yes or no to each question. Are you known as Johnny?
Yes.
Is today Tuesday?
Yes.
Keep perfectly still for me.
Which is quite difficult when your big toes jam down on a drawing pin.
Are you wearing a grey jacket?
Yes.
With the baseline questions over, it was time for the main interrogation to begin. I was also hoping another trick might fool the machine. Stress makes you sweat more, which increases your skin conductivity, putting telltale spikes on the graph. So earlier, I'd sprayed my fingers with antiperspirant to reduce the flow.
The test has started. Regarding the missing games console, do you intend to answer truthfully each question about that?
Yes.
Prior to age 25, did you ever steal anything from a shop?
Yes.
Famously, in the late 80s, CIA agent Aldrich Amis beat 2 polygraph tests while he was spying for the Russians by apparently just being super relaxed. Have my techniques worked with similar results?
Prior to 2005, have you ever taken anything from a friend knowing you would not return it?
No.
Do you know where the missing games console is right now?
No.
Did you take the missing games console that Richard was using?
No.
Well, Johnny, it would come at the end of your test, and I'm afraid to tell you that you actually failed the test. There's one particular question, which was, did you take the missing games console from the bench in the lab? And it shows a significant change in your breathing, in your galvanic sweat resistance, and your blood pressure. You failed one question, so you failed the entire test.
I'd made a fatal error. Apparently, the pain-induced stress caused by the drawing pin produced a totally different spike to that caused by nervous stress. And tests have shown that most antiperspirants actually increase skin conductivity. I may not have beaten the lie detector, but a failed test isn't enough for a conviction in a UK court of law, although it might help persuade a jury.
So that's an interesting video. Fun to look at somebody trying to beat the test, but very important for us to just recognize the effects of the autonomic nervous system and how this can be utilized in modern life. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture, the peripheral nervous system. Take care.